My fingers traced the rim of my wine glass as Eric's voice boomed across our dining room, commanding attention like he always did. The dinner party was in full swing, our table filled with his colleagues from the defense contracting firm where he worked as a project manager. I'd spent the afternoon preparing everything perfectly: herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, a chocolate tart that took 3 hours to make. Eric would take credit for the menu later, just like he always did. So Lena, Jennifer Morrison, Eric's supervisor, turned to me with that practice smile executives wear when they're making small talk. Eric tells us you work in administration. Which department? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The question hung in the air like smoke from the candles I'd lit. I felt Eric's eyes on me, that familiar warning glance that said, "Don't embarrass me." I'd learned to read those looks over our 4 years of marriage, the way his jaw tightened when he thought I might say something that would reflect poorly on his image. "Oh, just general office work," I said quietly, cutting my salmon into precise pieces. Nothing too exciting. That's when Eric laughed. That particular laugh he'd perfected, the one that made me feel smaller with each note. "She's being modest," he said, reaching over to squeeze my shoulder just tight enough to sting. "Lena's a secretary at a government office. Files papers, answers phones, mixes coffee. You know, the essential stuff that keeps the world running." The table erupted in polite chuckles. David Chen, Eric's closest friend at work, shook his head with mock sympathy. "Well, someone has to do the grunt work, right? Not everyone can be in strategic planning." "Exactly," Eric said, his voice growing more animated with each word. "Some people are just built for different things. Lena here, she's never been much for ambition, prefers the quiet life. No pressure, no deadlines, no real responsibility." He took a large gulp of wine. "It must be nice to clock out at 5 and never think about work again." I felt heat creep up my neck, that familiar burn of humiliation I'd grown accustomed to. The worst part wasn't Eric's words. It was watching his colleagues nod along, their faces full of patronizing understanding. Jennifer actually patted my hand across the table. "You must be so proud of Eric's success, though. His promotion last month was well-deserved. The way he handled that classified contract negotiation was brilliant." The classified contract negotiation. I knew that deal intimately. I'd spent 6 months analyzing the foreign intelligence implications, tracking financial flows through 3 different countries, and building a risk assessment that ultimately saved the Pentagon $40 million. But Eric wouldn't know that. To him, it was just another contract his company had won. "I am proud," I managed, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Eric works very hard." "She's lucky to have such a driven husband," David chimed in. "Must be reassuring to know you don't have to worry about supporting the household, Lena. Eric's got it handled." The laughter started again, louder this time. I watched their faces, these people who thought they knew me, who saw only what Eric had told them to see: the quiet wife, the simple secretary, the woman with no ambitions of her own. Something cracked inside me then. Not broke, I was far too trained for that, but cracked, like ice under pressure, still holding, but forever changed. "Excuse me," I said carefully. "I should check on dessert." I walked to the kitchen on steady legs, my training kicking in automatically. Never show weakness. Never let them see you break. In the kitchen, I gripped the marble counter and allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of deep breathing before my phone buzzed. The notification appeared on my screen like a bolt of lightning. Priority encrypted message, classified. My secure phone, the one Eric had never seen, hidden in the false bottom of my jewelry box, was pulsing with an urgent signal. My fingers moved to the device automatically, muscle memory taking over as I entered the decryption code. "Porter, need you at Langley 0800 tomorrow. Critical breach in Operation Nightingale. Rhodes. Director Samuel Rhodes. The only person outside of Maya who knew where I really spent my days, who I really was when I was playing the role of Eric's insignificant wife. Operation Nightingale. My operation. The counterintelligence network I'd spent 2 years building, tracking Russian financial infiltration into American defense contracts. The same type of contracts Eric's company handled. I deleted the message and slipped the phone back into my pocket with my hands rock steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. In the dining room, Eric's voice carried on, regaling his colleagues with another story about his professional prowess. "I should head home early," I heard Jennifer say, as I returned with the dessert plates. Eric glanced at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Confusion, maybe? Or the first hint that his perfect, controllable wife wasn't feeling quite so controllable anymore.
"Lena gets headaches when she's tired," he said dismissively. "Don't you, sweetheart? All that stress from answering phones." I set down the chocolate tart and looked directly at him. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. "Yes," I said quietly. "I do get headaches, usually when people underestimate what I'm capable of." The table went silent. Eric's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Well," Jennifer said, after an awkward pause, "this tart looks absolutely divine." But I was already walking toward the hallway, pulling my jacket from the closet. "I think I will turn in early tonight," I called over my shoulder. "Eric, you can handle cleanup, can't you?" I didn't wait for his answer. The bedroom door clicked shut behind me with finality, sealing me off from Eric's confused protestations and the murmured conversations of his guests. I could hear him making excuses for my behavior, his voice carrying that edge it got when he felt his control slipping. Let him explain. Let him spin another story about his moody, unstable wife. Tonight, it didn't matter what Eric Porter thought about anything. I walked to my dresser, fingers moving to the seemingly decorative jewelry box on top. A casual observer would see expensive pearls and simple gold chains, the accessories of a woman who preferred to blend into the background. Eric had bought most of these pieces for me over the years, each one chosen to make me look appropriately subdued for his work functions. My fingernail found the tiny groove in the box's bottom panel, and the false compartment opened with a nearly silent click. Inside, a phone that had never appeared on any billing statement, a set of credentials that would get me through security at buildings Eric would never be allowed to enter, and a small silver key that unlocked the desk drawer he'd never thought to question. The secure laptop came to life under my fingers, its screen displaying a login prompt that required 3 different biometric confirmations: retinal scan, fingerprint, voice pattern recognition. In 30 seconds, I was inside a classified network that contained intelligence briefings from 6 continents. The priority message from Rhodes was waiting for me, along with 17 other communications that had accumulated over the past 6 hours. I opened the director's briefing first, my eyes scanning the details with practiced efficiency. Operation Nightingale compromised. Suspected internal leak. Deputy Director Thomas Greer requests immediate debrief on all strategic assessments. Claims your reports may contain inaccuracies that need correction before congressional review. My jaw tightened. Thomas Greer, the man who'd spent the last 8 months trying to take credit for every successful operation that crossed his desk, including mine. I'd been tracking his movements for weeks, watching him slowly position himself to steal the intelligence work I'd spent 2 years developing. I pulled up the operation files, my own reports staring back at me in neat, classified rows. Financial tracking through 17 different shell companies. Communication intercepts between Russian operatives and American business leaders. A network map that showed exactly how foreign intelligence was infiltrating defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The same defense contracts that Eric's company was bidding on? My fingers hovered over the keyboard as pieces clicked into place in my mind. Eric's sudden promotion last month, his access to classified bidding information,
The way he'd started asking seemingly casual questions about my boring office job and whether I ever heard anything interesting. I opened a new search window and typed in Eric's company name, cross-referencing it with the financial foes I'd been tracking. The results made my stomach drop. Porter Defense Solutions, Eric's firm, was listed in 3 separate intelligence reports as a potential infiltration target. Not as a perpetrator, but as a company's security protocols were considered soft targets for Russian financial manipulation. My husband wasn't a traitor. He was just a useful idiot who'd been carefully cultivated by people far smarter than he was. Another message appeared on my screen. Maya Patel requesting secure communication. I opened the encrypted chat window, and Maya's familiar voice filled my earpiece as disguised as a routine call from a college friend discussing weekend plans. Anyone listening would hear 2 women making dinner arrangements. The reality was far different. "Talk to me, Porter." Maya's voice was crisp, professional. "Rhodes sent word you're being activated. Greer's making his move. He's claiming my reports need correction before they go to Congress. He's going to try to rewrite everything to make himself look like the mastermind."
I looked at the evidence spread across my screen, months of careful intelligence work that could disappear with a few keystrokes if Greer gained access to the files. He's been planning this for months, probably from the moment he realized how valuable Nightingale was going to be. Can you prove it? I can prove he's been accessing my reports without authorization. I can prove he's been sharing credit for operations he never touched. But proving intent to steal credit? I paused, considering. That's harder. Unless we catch him in the act. Exactly what I was thinking. Maya, I need you to do something for me. Tomorrow morning, early. Can you access Greer's calendar and see if he's scheduled any meetings with congressional staffers? Already on it. And Porter, Rhodes is serious about this. He's talking about a full counterintelligence review. If Greer's been compromising operations to build his own career, people are going to lose their jobs. Or worse. I understood the implication. In the intelligence world, or worse, covered a multitude of sins that ended with prison sentences and destroyed lives. "I'll be there at 8, I told Maya. And Maya, make sure we have a conference room that can hold the entire senior staff. If we're doing this, we're doing it right." I closed the laptop and returned everything to its hiding places, my movements automatic after years of practice. In the bathroom mirror, I caught myself, still wearing the demure blouse and simple skirt I'd chosen for Eric's dinner party, the costume of a woman who wanted to disappear. Tomorrow, I will wear something different. Tomorrow, I will walk into Langley as myself, Lena Porter, senior intelligence analyst, architect of Operation Nightingale, and the woman who spent 2 years protecting American interests while her own husband mocked her as just a secretary. From the dining room came the sound of chairs scraping and goodbyes being exchanged. Eric's voice rose above the others, still trying to control the narrative of his wife's mysterious headache. Let him wonder. Let him lie awake tonight trying to figure out what had changed in his perfectly controllable world. Tomorrow, he would learn exactly who he'd been living with all along. Eric's alarm went off at 6:30, the same as always, and I felt him stir beside me in the pre-dawn darkness. For 4 years, I'd matched his schedule, rising when he did to make his coffee and lay out his clothes like the dutiful wife he expected me to be. This morning, I lay still and listened to him stumble toward the shower, muttering under his breath about my strange behavior the night before. 20 minutes later, he emerged from the bathroom, already dressed in his best suit, navy blue with the red tie bought him for his birthday, the one he wore when he wanted to make an impression. He was humming. Actually humming, the way he did when he felt particularly good about himself. "Coffee smells good," he called toward the bed, assuming I was already downstairs preparing his breakfast. When I didn't respond, he poked his head back into the bedroom. "Lena, are you feeling better?" I sat up slowly, letting my hair fall loose around my shoulders instead of pulling it back into the tight bun he preferred. "Much better, thank you." Something in my tone made him pause. In the gray morning light, I could see him trying to read my expression, looking for the apologetic smile that usually followed any deviation from my expected behavior. "Good," he said finally. "Look, about last night, the guys were just having fun. You know how it is with work talk." "I know exactly how it is." He frowned at my response, but was already reaching for his phone, checking emails and messages with the obsessive dedication that had earned him his recent promotion. I've got that big presentation today, the one for the Peterson Group contract. Could make or break my next review cycle. The Peterson Group. I knew that name from my files, a defense contractor that had popped up in 3 separate intelligence reports over the past 6 months. Not clean, but not dirty enough to warrant investigation. The gray area where ambitious men like Eric built their careers. Sounds important, I said, swinging my legs out of bed. You should go get your coffee. I need to get ready for work myself. Work? He looked genuinely confused. Since when do you go in early? Mrs. Henderson lets you set your own schedule.
Mrs. Henderson, the fictional supervisor I'd created 2 years ago to explain my flexible hours. Amazing how easily Eric had accepted that story, how readily he'd believed his wife was working for a woman who, apparently, never held meetings, never required overtime, and never seemed to exist anywhere but in my carefully constructed lies. Special project, I said, walking past him toward the bathroom. Might be late tonight. I closed the door before he could respond, turning on the shower to mask the sound of my movements. From my real toiletry bag, the one hidden behind the cleaning supplies Eric never touched, I pulled out the professional makeup I hadn't used in public for years. Foundation that didn't make me look pale and tired, lipstick that suggested confidence rather than submission, eyeshadow that brought out the intelligence in my gaze instead of hiding it. When I emerged from the bathroom 30 minutes later, Eric was already gone. A note on the kitchen counter read, "Gone early to prep for Peterson. Don't wait up if I'm celebrating tonight. E." Perfect. I wouldn't need to explain why I wasn't home for dinner. I opened the closet Eric rarely paid attention to and selected an outfit from the section he'd never seen me wear, a charcoal gray suit with clean lines and a cut that suggested authority. The jacket fit perfectly across my shoulders, tailored to accommodate the slight build that years of physical training had given me. Black heels that added 3 inches to my height and clicked with purpose against hardwood floors. In the mirror, I looked like a different person entirely. Not Eric's mousy wife, but someone who belonged in rooms where decisions were made and lives hung in the balance. The drive to Langley took 40 minutes through Virginia traffic that moved like thick honey in the early morning rush. I'd made this commute hundreds of times, but always in my economy sedan with its outdated GPS and AM radio. Today, I drove the car Eric didn't know about, a black BMW with government plates and communication equipment that could patch me directly into secure channels. The first checkpoint recognized my credentials immediately. The guard's posture straightened when he saw my clearance level, his casual morning demeanor shifting to professional attention. "Good morning, Miss Porter. Director Rhodes is expecting you." "Thank you, Sergeant." 2 more checkpoints, each one deeper inside the complex, each guard treating me with increasing deference. By the time I reached the executive floor, word had spread that Lena Porter was in the building and heading upstairs. Junior analysts stepped aside in the hallways, some nodding respectfully, others trying to get a better look at the woman whose reports they'd been studying for months without ever seeing her face. Rhodes' assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine, who'd been screening his appointments for over a decade, looked up from her computer as I approached. "Director Rhodes asked me to send you right in," she said, her tone carrying the kind of respect reserved for people who held real power. The door to Rhodes' office opened before I could knock. Samuel Rhodes stood 6'3" in his stocking feet, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been running counterintelligence operations since I was born, and his reputation for protecting valuable assets was legendary throughout the intelligence community. "Lena," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming in early. We have a situation." His windows looked out over the Virginia countryside, but the blinds were drawn tight, casting the room in the artificial light that marked serious conversations. On his desk, a stack of files bore the red classification stamps that meant congressional oversight and potential criminal prosecution. "Talk to me about Thomas Greer," Rhodes said without preamble, settling behind his desk. "Specifically, talk to me about what he's been doing with your reports." I took the chair across from him, crossing my legs and leaning forward slightly, the posture of someone who had important information to share. He's been systematically altering my intelligence assessments before they go up the chain. Not the facts, but the analysis, making it look like the strategic insights came from his office instead of mine. How long? 8 months, maybe longer. I only started documenting it when I realized the pattern. Rhodes nodded grimly. The Congressional Intelligence Committee is asking questions about Operation Nightingale. Specifically, they want to know who's been running strategic analysis on Russian financial infiltration. Greer's claiming it's been his operation from the beginning. The words hit me like ice water. 2 years of my life's work, reduced to Thomas Greer's career advancement? Sir, with respect, that's not just theft, it's potentially compromising ongoing operations. If Greer doesn't understand the intelligence he's claiming to have developed, he could get people killed. Rhodes' voice was flat, final. Which is why you're going to help me stop him today.
He stood and walked to the window, looking out through a gap in the blinds. Greer scheduled a meeting with committee staffers at 2 o'clock this afternoon. He plans to present Operation Nightingale as his brainchild and recommend certain modifications to our approach. Modifications that would destroy everything I'd built, compromise sources that had taken months to develop, and potentially expose American assets to foreign intelligence services. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Rhodes turned back to me, and I saw something I'd never seen in his expression before. Fury held barely in check. "I need you to walk into that conference room at 2 o'clock and remind everyone exactly who Lena Porter is." Maya Patel was waiting for me in conference room C7, a windowless space 3 floors below Rhodes's office that was swept for surveillance devices twice daily. She looked up from her laptop as I entered, her dark eyes sharp with the kind of focus that came from years of hunting through digital shadows for hidden truths. "Tell me you have something," I said, closing the door behind me and activating the room's electronic privacy shields. "Better than something," Maya replied, turning her screen toward me. "I have everything." For the past 8 months, Maya had been quietly documenting Greer's activities at my request, not because we suspected what he was doing, but because something about his behavior had felt wrong. Maya had a talent for reading people that made her invaluable in counterintelligence work. She could spot a lie from across a room and track patterns of deception through months of seemingly innocent interactions. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a timeline that stretched across her screen. "Every time you submitted a strategic assessment, Greer accessed the files within hours. Not unusual in itself. Deputy directors review everything. But watch what happens next." She clicked through a series of documents, showing me the progression of my reports as they moved up the chain of command. "Your original assessment of the Volkov financial network, submitted March 15th. Greer accesses it at 3:47 p.m. the same day. Then, at 11:23 p.m., he submits his own independent analysis that contains identical conclusions but reframes them as if he developed the intelligence himself." I leaned closer to the screen, reading through Greer's version of my work. It was skillfully done, not plagiarism in any legal sense, but intellectual theft disguised as collaborative analysis. He'd taken my insights about Russian money laundering through American defense contractors and presented them as his own strategic thinking. "How many times?" I asked. 14 separate instances over 8 months. And it's escalating. Maya pulled up more recent files. Last week's assessment of the Peterson Group, the one that flagged potential security vulnerabilities in their bidding process. Greer not only stole your analysis, but scheduled a private briefing with congressional staffers to present it as his work. The Peterson Group, the same contract Eric was presenting on today, the one he thought might make his career. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so potentially catastrophic. "There's more," Maya continued, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I've been monitoring Greer's communication patterns. He's been scheduling off-the-record meetings with defense industry lobbyists, sharing intelligence assessments that should never leave this building." She showed me a series of calendar entries from Greer's schedule, meetings with names I recognized from intelligence reports, people who worked in the gray areas between government service and private profit, the kind who traded information like currency. "That's not just theft," I said.
That's potentially espionage. Which is why we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Maya closed the laptop and looked at me directly. Lena, if we're wrong about this, if there's any legitimate explanation for what Greer's been doing, we could destroy our own careers. But if we're right and we don't act, people die, sources get compromised, operations get blown away. She nodded. And Greer gets promoted to director level, which means he'd have access to intelligence far beyond anything he's seen so far. I walked to the secure phone mounted on the conference room wall and dialed an extension from memory. Technical services? This is Porter. I need a surveillance team to review all electronic communications in and out of Deputy Director Greer's office for the past 72 hours. Yes, I have Director Rhodes's authorization. Thank you. Maya raised an eyebrow. Playing hardball? Greer made this personal when he decided to steal 2 years of my work. Now it's professional. I returned to my seat and pulled out my own secure tablet. Show me everything you have on his meeting schedule for today. The next 2 hours passed in focused intensity, as we built an airtight case against Thomas Greer. Maya's technical skills combined with my analytical training created a picture of systematic intelligence theft that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. We documented not just what Greer had done, but when he'd done it, who he'd shared information with, and how his actions had potentially compromised ongoing operations.
At 11:30 a.m., my secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Technical Services. Audio surveillance confirms Deputy Director Greer scheduled unauthorized briefing with congressional staffers at 1400 hours. Plans to present Operation Nightingale as his independent development. Full recording available for review. Maya whistled low under her breath. He's actually going to do it. He's going to walk into that room and claim your work as his own in front of congressional oversight. Not if we stop him first, I said, gathering our evidence files into a secure folder. Maya, I need you to contact every senior analyst who's worked on Nightingale components. Tell them there's a mandatory briefing at 1:30 p.m. in conference room A1. The executive conference room? Lena, that's where Rhodes holds director-level meetings. Yes. I stood, straightening my jacket. If Thomas Greer wants to play politics with national security, he's going to learn what happens when he picks a fight with someone who actually understands the intelligence he's been stealing. Maya was already reaching for her phone. This is really happening, isn't it? You're going to expose him in front of the entire senior staff. I'm going to remind everyone who actually developed the intelligence that's kept this country safe for the past 2 years. I paused at the door, looking back at my closest friend and ally. Maya, are you ready for what comes next? Because once we do this, there's no going back. My cover as Eric's invisible wife is over. My quiet life disappears forever. She met my gaze without hesitation. Lena, your quiet life was never real to begin with. You've been hiding behind a fake identity for so long, you've forgotten who you actually are. You're not Eric's secretary wife. You're the woman who built Operation Nightingale from nothing, who tracked Russian money through a dozen countries, who prevented foreign intelligence from compromising American defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Her words hit me with unexpected force. For years, I'd thought I was protecting myself by staying invisible, by letting people like Eric and Greer underestimate me. But Maya was right. I had been protecting them from me. Contact Rhodes, I told her. Tell him we're ready to proceed. And Maya, make sure Greer gets the meeting notification. I want him to walk into that room thinking he's in control. As I left the conference room, my reflection caught in the polished steel of the elevator doors. The woman looking back at me bore no resemblance to the quiet, apologetic wife who'd endured Eric's mockery the night before. This woman looked dangerous, competent, ready for war. Thomas Greer had no idea what was coming for him. By 6 p.m., I was back home, sitting at our kitchen table with a glass of wine and a mind still sharp from the day's preparations. Eric's car pulled into the driveway with the aggressive rumble he used when he wanted the neighbors to notice his success. The Peterson presentation had apparently gone well. He burst through the front door like a man carrying good news, his tie loosened and jacket slung over his shoulder with calculated casualness. "Lena, where are you? You're not going to believe this." I took another sip of wine and waited for him to find me. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face was flushed with excitement and what I suspected was celebration drinks with his colleagues.
"The Peterson deal," he announced, dropping into the chair across from me with satisfied exhaustion. "Sealed and signed. They loved the security analysis portion of our proposal, said that it showed exactly the kind of forward thinking they needed from a defense contractor." Security analysis. The same assessment I'd flagged in my intelligence reports as potentially compromised, the same vulnerabilities that Thomas Greer had been sharing with industry contacts, the same information that had somehow found its way into Eric's supposedly proprietary proposal. "Congratulations," I said evenly. "That sounds like quite an accomplishment." He loosened his tie completely and reached for my wine glass, taking a large gulp without asking. "It was brilliant, actually. We identified security risks that their other bidders completely missed. Dave thinks this could lead to a promotion, maybe even a partnership track." "How did you identify these security risks?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. Eric was used to me asking about his work, but usually my questions centered around when he'd be home or whether he needed dinner saved. Questions about methodology were new territory. "Research," he said, the answer coming too quickly. "Due diligence, industry analysis." "What kind of research?" Now he was frowning, his celebration mood shifting toward irritation. "Why all the questions, Lena? I thought you'd be happy for me. This is big for our future." Our future. The phrase hung between us like a challenge. For 4 years, Eric had made decisions about our future without consulting me, assuming my life would naturally shape itself around his ambitions. Tonight, that assumption felt different, naive. "I am happy for you," I said carefully. "I'm just trying to understand how these opportunities work, how someone gets access to the kind of information that would give them an edge in a competitive bidding process." His irritation sharpened into something approaching anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. I'm just curious about your work." "Since when?" Eric stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked our small backyard. "Since when do you ask detailed questions about anything, Lena? You've spent 4 years telling me your job is too boring to discuss, and now you want a breakdown of defense contracting strategy?" The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to land. I had spent 4 years deflecting his questions about my work, building a wall of deliberate dullness that kept him from looking too closely at my real life. "Maybe I'm tired of being left out," I said. "Maybe I want to understand the world you live in." "The world I live in?" He turned back to face me, and I saw something dangerous in his expression. The look of a man who felt his authority being questioned. "Lena, you don't live in my world. You live in a world where the most complicated decision you make is which filing cabinet to organize. Don't pretend you suddenly understand corporate strategy because you read a business article." The dismissal was so casual, so automatic that I almost admired its efficiency. 4 years of marriage, and Eric still saw me as fundamentally incapable of complex thought. "You're right," I said, standing to match his height advantage as much as possible. "I don't understand your world, but I'm starting to understand something else." "What's that supposed to mean?" "I'm starting to understand that you need me to be stupid. You need me to be invisible and unambitious and grateful for whatever scraps of attention you throw my way. Because if I wasn't those things, you might have to look at yourself more honestly." Eric's face went white, then red. "That's ridiculous. I've always supported my what? My complete lack of career goals? My willingness to make myself smaller so you could feel bigger? You're being dramatic." "Am I?" I moved closer to him, close enough to see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. "Eric, what do you actually know about me? About what I do during the day, who I talk to, what I think about?" "I know you're my wife. I know you work in some government office doing administrative work. I know you're usually happy with our life together." "And if I told you that wasn't true? Any of it?" He laughed, but it sounded forced. "What, you're going to tell me you're secretly a rocket scientist? That your boring office job is actually some kind of cover story?" The question hit so close to reality that I felt my training kick in, the automatic deflection that had protected my identity for years. But something in Eric's tone,
the casual mockery that assumed I was incapable of anything significant, made me pause. "What if I was?" I asked quietly. "What do you mean, what if you were?" "What if I was more than you think I am? What if everything you believe about me is wrong?" Eric stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to process a version of his wife that didn't fit the comfortable narrative he'd constructed. Then he shook his head, dismissing the possibility entirely. "Lena, you're not some secret agent or corporate executive. You're my wife. You make dinner and organize our social calendar and worry about whether we need new curtains. There's nothing wrong with that life, but don't pretend it's something it's not." The certainty in his voice was absolute, unshakable. Eric couldn't conceive of a reality where I held real power, where I made decisions that affected people's lives, where I operated in spheres he could never access. "You're right," I said, turning away from him. But as I walked toward the stairs, I added quietly, "The question is how long that's going to be enough for either of us." I left him standing in the kitchen, confusion and irritation warring on his face as he tried to understand what had just happened to his predictable, controllable world. Tomorrow, he would learn exactly who he'd been underestimating all along. At 1:15 p.m. the next day, I stood outside conference room A1, watching the senior staff of the CIA's counterintelligence division file through the doors, with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Director Rhodes had sent the meeting notification out an hour earlier, marked Priority Classification Review, all senior staff required, with no explanation beyond the time and location.
Maya appeared at my elbow, carrying a leather portfolio that contained copies of all our evidence. "Technical services delivered the audio files 20 minutes ago," she said quietly. "Greer's conversation with the congressional staffers is even more damaging than we thought. He didn't just claim credit for your work. He implied that you'd been providing him with raw intelligence that he then analyzed and shaped into actionable assessments. The implications hit me immediately. If Greer's story held, I would be reduced to nothing more than a data collector, feeding information to my intellectual superior for proper analysis. 2 years of strategic thinking, pattern recognition, and complex intelligence work would disappear into Thomas Greer's resume." "How many people know the real timeline?" I asked. "Everyone in that room worked on some component of Operation Nightingale," Maya replied. "They all know who developed which pieces of the analysis. The question is whether they'll have the courage to contradict a deputy director in front of congressional oversight." Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see the attendees settling into their seats around the polished mahogany table. 12 senior analysts, 3 section chiefs, 2 deputy directors, and Director Rhodes himself, positioned at the head of the table like a judge preparing to hear testimony. The only empty chairs were mine and Thomas Greer's. At 1:28 p.m., Greer arrived with his own portfolio and the confident stride of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was dressed impeccably, Armani suit, Italian leather shoes, the kind of expensive watch that suggested success in circles beyond government service. As he entered the room, several analysts nodded deferentially, acknowledging his rank and the power that came with it. Greer took his seat without looking in my direction, though I knew he was aware of my presence. We'd worked in the same building for 3 years, attended the same briefings, reviewed each other's assessments through the formal channels that governed all intelligence work. But we'd never been alone in a room together, never had a direct confrontation about methodology or analysis. That was about to change. "Ladies and gentlemen," Director Rhodes began, his voice carrying the authority that came from 30 years of intelligence work and the respect of every person in the room. "We're here to address some concerns that have been raised about the development and attribution of Operation Nightingale, specifically the strategic assessments that formed the foundation of our congressional briefings." He looked directly at me. "Senior Analyst Porter, would you please walk us through the operational timeline?" I stood, feeling the weight of 12 pairs of eyes as I moved to the presentation screen at the front of the room. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since Maya and I had begun documenting Greer's activities, the moment when my invisible work would finally become visible. Operation Nightingale began 18 months ago, I said, clicking through the first slide of a presentation I'd assembled that morning. Initial intelligence suggested Russian financial operatives were targeting American defense contractors through a network of shell companies and intermediary financial institutions. I walked them through the development of the operation, slide by slide, showing how I'd identified the pattern, tracked the money flows, and built the intelligence network that ultimately exposed the scope of foreign infiltration. With each slide, I could see recognition dawning on the faces around the table. Analysts who remembered providing me with specific pieces of information, section chiefs who had approved my requests for additional resources, deputy directors who had signed off on my operational proposals. The strategic assessment that identified the Peterson Group as a potential target was completed on March 20th and submitted through proper channels on March 21st. The analysis indicated that the company's security protocols were insufficient to prevent foreign intelligence penetration of their bidding process. Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. The Peterson assessment had been classified at the highest levels specifically because it identified ongoing vulnerabilities in the defense contracting system. The assessment recommended immediate notification of the FBI's counterintelligence division and suggested enhanced security measures for all companies bidding on similar contracts, I added, watching Thomas Greer's face for any reaction. He remained perfectly composed, the expression of a man listening to information he had heard before, information he had every right to know. But I caught the slight tightening around his eyes when I mentioned the FBI recommendation, the one part of my assessment that hadn't made it into his stolen version. Senior Analyst Porter, came a voice from the table. Section Chief Williams, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for asking pointed questions. Who else had access to this particular assessment? Deputy Director Greer accessed the classified files at 4:15 p.m. on March 21st. Deputy Director Harrison reviewed them on March 23rd. Director Rhodes received the final report on March 25th. And the congressional briefing materials, Williams continued. Who prepared those?
This was the crucial moment. I looked directly at Thomas Greer, seeing him tense almost imperceptibly as he realized where the conversation was heading. The briefing materials submitted to congressional oversight were prepared by Deputy Director Greer's office, I said. However, they contained strategic assessments and analytical conclusions that were identical to those in my original report, despite being presented as independent analysis. The room went absolutely silent. Even the ambient noise of the building's ventilation system seemed to pause as everyone processed what I'd just said. Thomas Greer leaned forward, his composure finally cracking slightly. Senior Analyst Porter, I think you're mischaracterizing the collaborative nature of intelligence analysis. All strategic assessments go through multiple levels of review and refinement. Deputy Director Greer, Director Rhodes interrupted smoothly. Perhaps you'd like to respond to these concerns after Senior Analyst Porter has finished presenting her findings? Maya passed me another folder, this one containing the audio transcripts from technical services, the evidence that would end Thomas Greer's career and clear the way for everything that came next. Of course, I said, clicking to the next slide. There is quite a bit more to cover. The next slide appeared on the screen with devastating clarity, a side-by-side comparison of my original March 21st assessment and Thomas Greer's congressional briefing materials dated March 28th. Identical strategic conclusions, identical risk evaluations, identical recommendations down to the specific wording of critical security protocols. As you can see, I continued, my voice steady despite the electricity in the room, Deputy Director Greer's briefing materials contain not just similar analysis to my original report, but identical language in 17 separate instances. Section Chief Williams leaned forward, studying the screen with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades identifying patterns in intelligence work. That's unusually specific convergence for independent analysis. It would be, I agreed, if the analysis had been independent. Thomas Greer finally spoke, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone in the room of his rank. Senior Analyst Porter, I think you're mischaracterizing the collaborative nature of intelligence analysis. All senior staff review and contribute to strategic assessments. The fact that final reports incorporate language from preliminary analysis is not unusual, it's expected. A reasonable response. The kind of bureaucratic deflection that probably worked for him dozens of times before. But I had spent months preparing for this moment, anticipating every possible defense he might offer. "You're absolutely right, sir," I said, clicking to the next slide. "Collaboration is expected, which is why I documented every instance of official collaboration on Operation Nightingale." The new slide showed a detailed timeline of formal communications, email chains, meeting notes, official review processes. Every legitimate interaction between my office and Greer's was listed with timestamps and approval codes. As you can see, Deputy Director Greer's office never requested formal collaboration on the strategic assessment portions of Operation Nightingale. No formal meeting reviews were scheduled, no collaborative analysis requests were submitted through proper channels. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Which means his access to my work was entirely through classified file reviews, access that was supposed to be for oversight purposes, not content appropriation. The room's atmosphere had shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching judicial proceedings. Deputy Director Harrison, Greer's counterpart in operations, was taking notes with the careful precision of someone who understood they were witnessing a career-ending revelation. Maya stood from her seat at the far end of the table. "If I may, Director Rhodes, Technical Services completed their review of electronic communications, as requested." Rhodes nodded. "Please proceed." Maya activated the room's audio system, and a familiar voice filled the space. Thomas Greer, recorded just 18 hours earlier in a conversation with congressional staffers. The Russian financial infiltration network was incredibly sophisticated. It took months of strategic analysis to identify the pattern and trace the money flows through their shell company structure. The breakthrough came when I realized they were targeting defense contractors with vulnerable security protocols. Every person in the room recognized the description. My analysis, my strategic insights, my breakthrough moments, presented as Greer's intellectual property. The recording continued. My assessment of the Peterson Group specifically identified security vulnerabilities that made them a prime target. I recommended immediate FBI notification and enhanced security measures for all related contracts. I watched Greer's face as his own voice betrayed him. His earlier composure had completely disappeared, replaced by the desperate calculation of a man trying to find an escape route that didn't exist.
Technical Services has additional recordings, Maya continued, documenting Deputy Director Greer's conversations with defense industry contacts, sharing classified assessments in apparent violation of information security protocols. The final blow. Not just intellectual theft, but potential espionage. Director Rhodes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "Deputy Director Greer, would you care to respond to these allegations?" Greer looked around the table, perhaps hoping to find an ally willing to support his version of events. Instead, he found 12 faces studying him with the professional detachment of intelligence analysts who just witnessed a case study in career suicide. "Director Rhodes," Greer began, his voice strained but still carrying traces of his earlier authority, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the collaborative nature—" "No," I interrupted, surprising myself with the force of my own voice. "There's been no misunderstanding." The room went silent. In the CIA's rigid hierarchy, senior analysts did not interrupt deputy directors, ever. But something had shifted inside me during the past 2 days. Some fundamental change that made old rules feel suddenly irrelevant. For 18 months, I built Operation Nightingale from nothing. I identified the Russian financial network, traced their infiltration methods, developed the intelligence sources, and wrote every strategic assessment that Congress has been reviewing. While I was doing that work, Deputy Director Greer was systematically stealing credit for it and sharing classified intelligence with unauthorized contacts. I turned to face him directly. "You've spent your career taking credit for other people's work, haven't you? How many operations carry your name that were actually developed by analysts you outrank and intimidate?" Greer's face went dark red. "You're out of line, Porter." "Am I?" I asked. "Because I'm just a senior analyst who answers phones and files papers, right? That's what you told the congressional staffers yesterday, that I was just a data collector who fed you raw intelligence for proper analysis." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Around the table, senior staff who had worked with me for years exchanged glances that carried a mixture of recognition and growing anger.
They knew my capabilities, knew the quality of my work, knew exactly how much intellectual firepower went into the assessments Greer had been claiming as his own. The question now, I said, returning to my position at the front of the room, is what we do about it. Director Rhodes stood slowly, his movement commanding immediate attention from everyone present. What we do about it, he said, his voice carrying the finality of administrative judgment, is ensure that credit for Operation Nightingale goes where it belongs, that classified intelligence protocols are properly enforced, and that this kind of intellectual theft never happens again in my organization. He looked directly at Thomas Greer. Deputy Director, I think we need to discuss your future with this agency. Privately. The dismissal was absolute, professional, and devastating. The silence that followed Rhodes' pronouncement stretched for exactly 12 seconds. I counted automatically, a habit from years of intelligence work where timing could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Then Thomas Greer made his fatal mistake. "This is ridiculous," he said, standing abruptly from his chair. "I'm being accused by a junior analyst who clearly doesn't understand how strategic intelligence works at this level. Porter has been feeding me preliminary data for months. I'm the one who shaped it into actionable intelligence." His voice carried the desperation of a man watching his career collapse in real time, but also the arrogance that had gotten him into this situation. Even cornered, even caught with irrefutable evidence, Thomas Greer couldn't resist one final attempt to diminish my role. Director Rhodes reached for the secure phone mounted on the conference room wall. "Security to conference room A1, priority escort required." "Director Rhodes," he continued, his voice rising, "you're making a serious mistake. This woman has been operating outside proper channels, conducting unauthorized surveillance, making accusations that could damage congressional relations." The only person who damaged congressional relations was the deputy director who lied to oversight staffers about the source of critical intelligence assessments. Maya opened her portfolio and distributed copies of a document I hadn't seen before. A congressional inquiry letter dated that morning asking pointed questions about discrepancies in the intelligence briefings they'd received. Congressman Bradley's office called at 7 a.m. Apparently, some of the strategic assessments they received didn't match information they'd been given in previous briefings. They specifically asked to speak with the original analyst who developed Operation Nightingale.
The implications were immediate and devastating. Congressional oversight committees didn't make casual inquiries about intelligence attribution. If they were asking questions about source credibility, it meant Greer's theft had created inconsistencies that threatened the entire operation. The conference room door opened, and 2 security officers entered. Not the casual building guards who checked IDs at entry points, but federal agents in dark suits with the kind of presence that made even senior CIA staff straighten in their chairs. "Gentlemen," Director Rhodes addressed them, "Deputy Director Greer needs to be escorted to his office to collect personal items, then removed from the building. His security clearances are to be suspended immediately." "This is insane," Greer said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "I've given 15 years to this agency. You're destroying my career over a personality conflict with a subordinate analyst." "I'm destroying your career," Rhodes replied with icy calm, "because you compromised national security to advance your own interests. The personality conflict is irrelevant." One of the security officers stepped forward. "Deputy Director Greer, if you'll come with us, please." As Greer moved toward the door, he passed directly by my chair. For a moment, I thought he might ignore me entirely, preserve what dignity he had left by maintaining professional composure. Instead, he stopped and looked down at me with pure venom. "You think you've won something," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "But they'll never really trust you now. You're the analyst who destroyed a deputy director. That kind of reputation follows you forever." I looked up at him calmly. "Thomas, you destroyed yourself. I just documented it." He started to respond, but then seemed to realize that every word he spoke was digging his grave deeper. The security officers flanked him professionally, not touching him but making it clear that he would leave the building whether he cooperated or not. "Deputy Director Greer," one of the officers said formally, "your escort begins now." As they walked him toward the door, Greer made one final attempt to control the narrative.
"This isn't over," he called back to the room. "There are proper channels for these kinds of accusations. Congressional oversight will want to review the entire investigation." "Congressional oversight," Director Rhodes interrupted, "will be receiving a full briefing on your unauthorized disclosure of classified intelligence to industry contacts. I suspect they'll be quite interested in that conversation." The door closed behind Greer and his escorts with a soft click that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. 12 senior staff members looked at each other with the shared recognition that they'd just witnessed something unprecedented. Not just the fall of a deputy director, but the rise of someone they'd all underestimated. Section Chief Williams broke the silence. "Well," he said dryly, "that was educational." A few nervous chuckles around the table, the kind of release that comes after intense pressure finally breaks. "Senior Analyst Porter," Director Rhodes said, returning to his seat at the head of the table, "I believe we have some organizational changes to discuss." Maya caught my eye from across the room and smiled. Not with satisfaction at Greer's downfall, but with pride at seeing her friend finally step into the recognition she'd earned years ago. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see other CIA staff watching the security escort make its way down the hallway. Word would spread through the building within hours. Thomas Greer was gone, his career destroyed by allegations of intellectual theft and unauthorized intelligence disclosure. But more importantly, word would spread about who had brought him down. Lena Porter, the senior analyst who'd spent years working quietly behind the scenes, had finally stepped into the light. And she wasn't planning to step back into the shadows. By 8 p.m., I was sitting in my living room with a glass of wine and a mind that felt strangely calm despite the day's upheaval. The house was quiet in the way that only came when you knew you were completely alone. Not just physically, but existentially. Eric wasn't just absent, he was irrelevant to what came next. My secure phone had been buzzing all afternoon with messages from colleagues, reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of Thomas Greer's removal, and congressional staffers who wanted to schedule follow-up briefings. The story was already spreading through Washington's intelligence community. A senior analyst had exposed a deputy director's systematic theft of classified work backed by irrefutable evidence and audio recordings that left no room for alternative interpretation. I heard Eric's car in the driveway at 8:47 p.m., earlier than usual for a weeknight. His key turned in the lock with the hesitant sound of a man who wasn't sure what he'd find on the other side of the door. "Lena," his voice carried across the house with unusual uncertainty, "are you home?"
"In here," I called from the living room, not bothering to move from my position on the couch. Eric appeared in the doorway, looking disheveled in a way that had nothing to do with his usual end-of-workday fatigue. His tie was crooked, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held the wide, almost panicked expression of someone whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally shaken. "We need to talk," he said, entering the room, but remaining standing, as if sitting would commit him to a conversation he wasn't sure he wanted to have. "About what?" He ran his hands through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd seen maybe 3 times in 4 years of marriage. "About whatever the hell happened today. Dave Chen called me an hour ago, asking if I knew my wife worked for the CIA. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him he was insane, that you work for some administrative office doing filing and scheduling." Eric's voice rose with each word. "I told him my wife is a secretary, not some kind of secret agent." I took another sip of wine, studying his face. The confusion there was genuine, not hurt or anger, but the deep disorientation of a man discovering that his fundamental assumptions about the world were wrong. "Dave Chen seemed pretty convinced," Eric continued. "Said his contact at the Pentagon heard from someone at Langley that a senior intelligence analyst named Lena Porter had exposed some deputy director for stealing classified work. Said it was the biggest scandal in the intelligence community in years. Dave Chen has good sources." The simple acknowledgement hit Eric like a physical blow. He actually staggered slightly, reaching for the back of a chair to steady himself. "Is that true?" His voice cracked on the question. "You actually work for the CIA?" "For 6 years. Senior analyst, counterintelligence division." "That's impossible!
but even as he said it, I could see him trying to reconcile this information with years of accumulated evidence he'd chosen to ignore. You leave for work every morning at the same time, you come home at normal hours, you've never traveled, never worked weekends, never acted like the high-powered professional you assumed you'd married. I finished. Eric, I've worked more weekends in the past 2 years than you have in your entire career. I've traveled to 6 countries for intelligence operations. Last month, when I told you I had the flu, I was actually in a secure briefing room at Langley for 72 straight hours, managing a counterintelligence crisis. He sat down heavily, his face pale. The dinner party, when I said you were just a secretary. You were introducing your wife to people who work in the same industry she spent years protecting. I set down my wine glass and looked at him directly. Eric, do you remember Jennifer Morrison asking about my work? She seemed genuinely interested in what I did. Yeah, so? Jennifer Morrison holds a defense contractor's clearance. She's probably read my intelligence assessments without knowing who wrote them. When you told her I was just a secretary, you were telling someone who relies on my analysis to keep her project secure that I was too stupid to matter. Eric stared at me in silence, processing the implications. I could almost see the pieces clicking into place. My strange questions about his Peterson Group presentation, my knowledge of security protocols he'd never mentioned, my sudden confidence during our argument the night before. Jesus Christ, he whispered. How long have you been lying to me? I've never lied to you about anything that mattered. Everything matters! His shock was transforming into anger, the emotion he always reached for when he felt out of control. You've been living a double life for our entire marriage. You let me think I was the successful one, the one with the important career. You let yourself think that. I interrupted. I never claimed to be unsuccessful. You assumed I was, because it made you more comfortable. This is insane! Eric stood and began pacing, his movements sharp with agitation. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? My colleagues are going to think I'm an idiot for not knowing what my own wife does for a living. Of course, even now, faced with the revelation that he'd been married to someone far more accomplished than he'd ever imagined, Eric's primary concern was his own reputation, his own embarrassment. Your colleagues, I said quietly, are going to realize that you've been dismissing and belittling someone who holds more security clearance than anyone in your company. They're going to wonder what other things you've been wrong about.
He stopped pacing and looked at me with something approaching fear. What does this mean? For us, I mean. What happens now? It was, finally, the right question. The one that mattered more than his wounded pride or professional embarrassment. I don't know, I said honestly. I spent 4 years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. That was my choice, and it wasn't fair to either of us. But I can't do it anymore. So what, you're going to divorce me? I'm going to stop pretending to be someone I'm not. Whether that's compatible with our marriage is something we'll have to figure out together. Eric sank back into his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I don't know how to be married to a CIA agent. Then maybe, I said gently, you should figure out how to be married to me. 3 weeks later, I stood in my new office at Langley, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the Virginia landscape through windows that were actually mine. The nameplate on my door read Lena Porter, Deputy Director, Strategic Intelligence Analysis. No pseudonym, no hidden identity, no apologies for taking up space. Maya knocked and entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied smile of someone who'd watched a friend finally claim what they'd earned. Did the congressional briefing go well yesterday? She asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Better than well. They're expanding Operation Nightingale into a full department initiative. I accepted the coffee, gratefully. Turns out, when you don't have someone stealing credit for your work, it's easier to build on success. Through my office window, I could see junior analysts arriving for the morning shift, young women and men who would work under my direct supervision, learning that intelligence work rewarded competence over politics, substance over self-promotion. "Any word from Eric?" Maya asked carefully. I touched the simple gold band that still circled my ring finger, though we'd been living separately since our confrontation 3 weeks ago. "He's in counseling, individual and marriage counseling. Says he wants to understand who he actually married. Think it'll work? I don't know." The answer came without pain now, just honest uncertainty. For 4 years, I needed him to underestimate me to protect my cover. He got comfortable with that dynamic. Whether he can love someone who doesn't need his permission to be powerful, that's something we're both going to have to learn. Maya nodded, understanding that some transformations couldn't be rushed or forced. My secure phone buzzed with a priority message from Director Rhodes. "Korean intelligence situation developing. Need your strategic assessment by 1400 hours. I smiled, feeling the familiar rush of important work that mattered, work that would carry my name in my analysis without apology or disguise. "Duty calls?" Maya asked, recognizing my expression. "Duty calls," I confirmed, already reaching for the classified files that would shape my next intelligence assessment. For the first time in years, I signed my real name to work that was entirely my own. The signature looks strange after so long in the shadows, but it looked right. Lena Porter was finally ready to be seen.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.